The camera looks a little high. Just a second. Sure. Just in case I write anything. Haven't had to do too many diagrams lately. Good afternoon, everyone. How is everyone doing? Good. Good. So we are drawing to the end of our book of Bamidbar. We are coming to the end of our journey through the wilderness, the Midbar, into the book of Numbers, and we get a double barrel of Matot and Masei as our two parshiot for this end. And as perhaps could be expected, and it's always good to try and anticipate what's coming next, Moses launches into a great deal of legislation that will be very practical once we enter the land of Israel. We get information about the land division. We get information about how the tithes, how the vows are going to be handled. A number of things that are going to have much greater relevance once we cross that border. But it's that second one that I want to talk about this morning, which is vows, oaths, promises. This is perhaps something that is not talked about enough, except when it is. There is a very famous piece, perhaps I'd say the most famous piece of high holiday liturgy that is all on this topic, which is Kol Nidre, right? Kol Nidre, all of our vows, right? That is literally what it starts off by saying. And that is something that is very important, and we're going to loop back to what Kol Nidre is actually trying to teach us by the end. But first, we have to figure out what vows are in the first place, which means we're going to start at the beginning. Page 941. This is chapter 30 of the book of Matot. Of the book of Bamidbar. It is the beginning of Parashah Matot. Page 941. Everyone found where we are? In whichever books you're looking in? Excellent. Then if my volunteer would volunteer.
Moses spoke to the heads of the Israelite tribes, saying, "This is what the Lord has commanded. First, if a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his pledge. He must carry out all that has crossed his lips." Okay, so before we turn the page, remember, we have to understand before we flip. What's the topic here then? What are these oaths, these vows?
Not break them.
Okay, don't break them, right? But
it's something that you bound yourself to do.
Okay.
So it's I promise to be here next week. I bound myself by my words to. That's my promise.
Maybe this is even stronger. I swear to God, I'll be here next week.
All right. So there's this phrase that's being used here, right? Of Ladonai.
It's the promise to God.
It says
I promise to God.
That's why I said.
Rather than promising you. Exactly.
And that makes a difference?
Oh, that's right. The other one is imposing an obligation on himself.
All right. Okay. So now we're seeing the different pieces. We have a vow to God, and we have an oath imposing upon myself. That is maybe something we're going to have to untangle of what might these two different varieties be. But the basic rule is that this is something that will cause a material difference in my life. Either I am refraining from something that normally I would have access to, or I am adding something, I am imposing something that I normally wouldn't have to do, whether it be dedicating a sacrifice that I'm not obligated to do, or whether it be I'm dedicating to make a contribution, to arrive at a certain point. There are definitely things that are happening here, and the invocation of God as being part of this promise, of this plan, it seems to be what's carrying the additional weight, and why God is saying, in particular, you have to make sure you do not violate whatever it is you vow. Yes?
Is in the Hebrew, we have here in English, vow, obligation, pledge, is,
Yeah.
Is it always the same word in Hebrew?
No, it's not always the same word. There are multiple words that can be used for different categories of self-imposed obligation or prohibition.
And a vow.
They do have differences within how they are carried out in Jewish law. It's not vast differences, and we're not going to go down the complete discussion of all the distinctions. We will get a little bit of information from Rambam, who's always a great summary. But yes, those are different words. And that may also lead us to understand why Kol Nidre doesn't just say Kol Nidre, but also mentions other words for types of vows and pledging. Because there is more than one way to say something that will be very similar in its effect. All right, so with that in mind, hopefully we'll understand then a little bit more what happens in verse 4 on page 942.
If a woman makes a vow to the Lord or assumes an obligation while still in her father's household by reason of her youth.
All right, so pause real quick. So what we're now saying is we got a woman, and she's doing the same thing that a man did in the first paragraph, which is why in that first paragraph, translating the word ish as man is entirely appropriate, because the laws of vow, excuse me, that looked like junk, and we'll turn off the ringer. The laws of vowing are different between men and women, as we're going to talk about. So here we have a woman that is still a young woman living in her father's household, living in the house where she grew up.
And her father learns of her vow or her self-imposed obligation, and he offers no objection. All her vows shall stand, and every self-imposed obligation shall stand. But if her father restrains her on the day he finds out, none of her vows or self-imposed obligations shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her, since her father restrained her.
Okay, so what's happening here? Just give me a summary of the if-then statement.
Well, if a woman, if a young girl, a teenager, promises something or other.
Right, so she is legally an adult, because that's, she's old enough to actually make a vow that would be a binding vow.
Well, it does say by reason of her youth, so I don't know how.
But she is still within her father's household,
But she's still in the
which
household.
was the normal way that a woman would live until she got married. Right? The idea of moving out and going to the city and having an apartment and having a sitcom, that's a very modern idea. And none of them could ever afford the apartments they have in those sitcoms. But back then, and really from many parts of the world, still to this day, you stay at home until you get married, and then you move into a house with someone else. And that goes for both men and women in many cultures. Okay, but in this case, we have a woman. She's an adult, but she's still under her father's household. And if she makes a vow, and he hears about it, and he says,
No, you're not.
no,
No.
then the vow is canceled. And it is not held against her that she failed to fulfill the vow, because it was her father's decision to cancel the vow, not hers. So it's not like she reneged. It's her father said, whoa. Not going to happen. That's not permitted. But if he hears about it and the day passes, then what's the status of the vow?
It holds.
It holds. It is as binding as any other person's vow. It is as binding as any man's vow. Right? Once the day has passed from which he heard the vow, the vow becomes an equal vow in all parts. Now, why this little distinction? This is not going to be the focus of our discussion, but I do want to clear it up because it can often be misunderstood as being misogynistic.
Right.
Is there a length of time between the time the girl makes the vow and the time the father hears it?
Once he hears of it, then that's when his clock starts running.
Okay.
Who inherits property?
Okay, so it comes back to the economy again, right?
Right.
What was that famous, was it Bill Clinton who had it's the economy stupid as part of his campaign messaging, right? So it comes back to the economy, which is to say, who owns the property that she is making vows of? If she says, I dedicate this sheep to be a sacrifice, who?
Oh.
Thank you for the sound effect of a sheep.
That's right.
Who owns the sheep?
God.
Well, who owns the
Her
sheep
father.
in her household?
In her household.
Her father.
Okay.
Right. So the father owns the sheep, technically. If she says, I refuse to eat the certain types of food, who's responsible for feeding her despite her new self-imposed imposition? Her father. Right. So she says, I'm no longer going to eat cheap bread. He's now responsible for buying expensive bread for her. So because of the way the economy was structured, because women typically did not have the same property ownership, because, as you mentioned, the property was primarily invested in land, in literal property. That meant that it had to follow the father's heritage in order that the tribal affiliation would be passed, and therefore the equality among the tribes for all people, both men and women within those tribes, would be maintained. So because of the way property was transferred and because of the need to have a tribal balance, it meant that women did not generally have the same property ownership potential as men. Women could, in certain circumstances, own property, but it was rarer, which meant that a woman who was still at home was probably not going to be endowed with her own property to be making her own vows about. Now, a woman who was, let's say, a widow or a divorcee who had not returned to her father's home, and so she's living her own life and she has her own resources, her vows are her vows, and there's no man that can cancel them. If she is married, then her husband, because he is now the property owner, is put in a position as her father was to agree or disagree. But they're not given an indefinite period. That's a very important part, right? Her vows do have weight. They just have to be checked against the budget. Once they've been checked against the budget, or at least the guy who controls the budget, then they become perfectly normal vows. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So like I said, we don't need to go into the details of this. Happens the same way with her husband. I want to get now into more of why do these matter so much that we would say, you know, that he does or doesn't cancel them, or can or can't cancel them. Why not just say, you know, if you make a vow, you should try your hardest, and if you don't, no big deal, right? And then, you know, okay, fine. So she's not able to do it because her father says no. Who would have thought she'd be in trouble for failing to fulfill a vow? Why are vows important? What is this whole deal about vows? And living in the 21st century, where most people take their promises, shall we say, less seriously than we see in this text, it may be hard for us to relate to the weight with which the ancient world, well, really, all the way up until the modern world, weighed the vows. Just one little bit of sociological, historical explanation. One of the reasons why we take vows less seriously now is because we have institutions that we believe will impose a fair or right solution on different problems. So my word doesn't matter as much because I've got a contract, right? My word doesn't matter so much because you can sue me, because there's a police officer who will punish me. And the other types of promises that I make to myself and other people, you know what? I don't care what you think about me. So what if I promised that I would show up to help with the barn raising, right? And then didn't show up. So what are you going to do? Punish me? Well, in the classical world, yeah. I mean, not punish like flog the person, but you would definitely punish them by not trusting them next time, by not being there to help them the same way, by not giving them the same social capital of saying, you know, you are part of our group to the same level. Nowadays, people rarely belong to groups with great sticking power, and that means their loyalty to the group and their loyalty to their word to the group or members of the group is not considered to be as important. It is a shame, unfortunately, and one thing has led to another. As we decrease the value of our words and of our promises, we also decrease our allegiance to the groups and the group to us, and that makes the group even weaker, which means our word becomes even less important. It's a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle. It has a feedback loop, a very negative feedback loop, in my opinion. But let's get back to the time when vows mattered, you know, about 100 years ago. So we're going to begin on the page, vows are divided. Like I said, this is Mishnah Torah. This is from Rambam, his summary of this idea of vowing.
Vows are divided into two classes. The first class relates to a person who forbids himself things that are permitted to him, as when he says, let the fruit products of a certain country be forbidden to me for 30 days or forever, or a certain kind of world's fruit products, or these fruit products shall be forbidden to me. No matter what language he uses in restricting himself, those things are forbidden to him, even in the absence of an oath or the mention of the divine name or its substitute.
All right, pause real quick.
Oh.
Pause real quick. So,
He didn't say I promise.
okay, so in the Mishnah and in other parts of Jewish law, they go into great detail of all of the official formulas of how a person can make a vow. And there's technical terms that are used. Kind of like you still see this in the modern courtroom setting, where, you know, I swear, da 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 da, or the inauguration of somebody to office. They'll often have to be sworn in before they can become president, representative, senator, or whatever. So we still see those formal things, and if they say it in their own words, we would all get a little jittery, right? I mean, imagine if it was an inauguration day and the president said, you know, yeah, I'm going to try my best to keep the Constitution and it'll be cool. we'd all be a little uncomfortable. Even though, really, come on, the content is the same. Right? He's saying that he's going to do the Constitution. That's pretty much all that the oath of office takes. But we want the words to be done in a particular way. We do want a formula which shows an adherence to the idea that those words represent. So we like formulas. And in Judaism, we also like formulas. But what Rambam is trying to bring to our attention here is that technically, the formulas are right and good and should be used carefully and properly, or not at all. But if you do make a promise that sounds like a promise, even if you don't put the formula in, you're still making a vow. And that is one that still needs to be fulfilled. And so you can't, have your fingers crossed behind your back and all of that. And that's going to work. By the way, I never understood why this means good luck and this means I'm lying. Same fingers. But yeah, you never think, cross your fingers. You never heard someone say cross your fingers for good luck?
Never.
Where have you been for the last 100 years?
In the Jewish community, we don't cross anything.
Occasionally we'll cross our legs.
Yeah, it's a little hard, yeah.
I heard that, but not this.
But you never heard someone cross their fingers behind their back as a way of saying I'm cheating, I'm lying?
It's a California thing.
Really?
Yeah, I've heard that.
Wow.
Oh,
This is what happens when cultures mingle.
Yeah. Yes.
So I've seen that in Hollywood movies as well, but I guess that's California.
That's
But
California.
I thought everything in Hollywood became universal because of it. But anyway, what he's trying to say is, who knew? Okay, so anyway, back to Rambam. What he's trying to say is our words matter, even if we're not putting it into the magic formula. Right? Even if, just for example, if we had that president who 2 years into his term decided to violate the Constitution, we wouldn't let him off the hook by him saying, well, I didn't use the magic formula when I swore myself in.
Right.
We'd say, no, the Constitution is the Constitution. Your word is your word, even if you didn't use the magic words. And that's what Rambam's trying to say, is that your word is your word. If you make a vow, God is still paying attention. And even if you didn't invoke God by name. Now, this is trying to help clarify that even though it says making a vow to God, it doesn't mean you have to use God's name in the vow. And a vow, even without God's name, is one that is still very important. By the way, this gets, what's the right word? Enshrined, I suppose, in modern Hebrew vernacular. Because if you want to tell somebody that you're going to try to do something, but you don't want to promise it, you'll say after you say, I'm going to be there next week, bli neder, right? This is not considered an oath, right? You'll immediately say, this is not an oath. This is not a vow, right? So I'm telling you I'm going to be there, but I'm not promising.
So is that crossing your fingers behind your back?
No, because crossing your fingers behind your back is intending to lie. Whereas bli neder is you're intending to say what I'm saying should not be misconstrued as a binding vow. It is I'm speaking with a language of intent, but I am not speaking with a language of promise.
So I'll try to be there.
I will try to be there, and my trying and my attempt should not be misunderstood as a vow. Therefore, if I fail because of some reason, it should not be seen as me breaking my vow. And that would, of course, not only make me in trouble with you, that would make me in trouble with God. And God knows I don't need more trouble with God. So that's why it's sort of used in, as an idiom almost, as someone saying, I'll try to say bli neder without vowing I'm going to be doing this. Make sense? Okay. Onward with more Rambam.
It's written in the Torah. If a man makes a vow imposing a prohibition on himself,
There's our verse from Numbers.
that is, he forbids himself things that are permitted. So also if he says, these things shall constitute a vow of abstinence for me, they are forbidden. I refer to this class of vows as vows of prohibition.
Okay. So the other type of vows that he goes on to talk about, again, read Mishnah Torah, it gives you more detail, are vows of consecration. That's a vow where you say, this sheep is going to be a sacrifice, where you consecrate something or the value of the item to be used for sacred purposes. But these vows, which are the type that are more common nowadays, are vows where a person makes a limit on themselves, right? I swear I'm never going to touch another drop of alcohol again. That kind of prohibition. But as he's pointing out, when you make a vow like that, what you are vowing is to not do something that you are permitted to do, right? If you make a vow that says, I'm no longer going to eat bacon, it's like, but you're not allowed to eat bacon, right? It's not kosher. So it's like, what exactly are you taking on by this vow, right? You're not adding anything to the obligations you currently have. You're just admitting an obligation you currently have. Whereas if you say, I vow to never eat orange juice again, God forbid you'd ever say that in Florida, well, orange juice is permitted. So to say I'm not going to have orange juice is considered to be now a binding promise, because you have added that to your list of things that you are no longer going to involve yourself with. Make sense? Okay.
But that's like a general vow. You just make a vow out in the open.
People still do. Right? People will still make a public declaration or a public vow in a way like that. Now, they don't always say I vow, right? And sometimes, and this is one of the points I want to try and see if we can't get to change for ourselves. Sometimes people make statements like this without even thinking about it, right? It's like, the person wakes up in the morning after having, a bit of a binge the night before, and they're like, man, I am never touching that stuff again, right? Technically, that's a language of vowing. And you're saying it in a casual way.
Even if you don't say, oh, I promise I'm never going to do it.
Exactly. Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle. No, you don't have to say the magic words, right?
Just watch what you say.
Well, it's not just watch what you say. Why are you choosing to say that? Right? What do you mean when you say, I'm never touching that stuff again? If what you mean is, I really do not want to go through that experience again, and I'm going to change my life to prevent myself from doing that, by all means, that is a perfectly fine sentence. But if what you mean by that sentence is, I really wish I could do what I did last night without having a hangover, which is often what people mean when they say that, then you're not actually regretting your action. You're not actually looking to change your behavior. You're not looking to prohibit yourself from doing something. You're just looking to escape the consequences. And oftentimes we will misuse promissory language as a means of expressing pseudo regret about something or pseudo self-improvement. You feel really, you can't fit into your suit, right? Or you go to put your pants on and too tight. And you're like, all right, that's it. I'm joining the gym, right?
Yeah.
You don't actually mean you're going to go exercise. I mean, sometimes people do, and otherwise there wouldn't be gyms. But exactly, I'm going to join the gym, and somehow that will magically make me thinner. Just by my membership card, I can use to scrape off the extra. But that's what it means. But usually when people say that, they mean, I wish I didn't look like this, but I'm not going to do anything about it. Right? And we use the language of promising as though somehow the promise is the magic. And the promise is there meant to keep us to fulfill the action. It's not meant to be a substitute for action. And that's what the words of our vowing is meant to remind us. And that's why we're supposed to be very careful in how we say them. Again, hold that in mind when we get back to our discussion of Kol Nidre. All right, so Sifrei wants to give us a little bit more information about who's doing this vowing.
So a man, if he vow a vow, that's praise.
Right, that was the sentence we began with.
A man means to exclude a minor, but this would exclude both a minor and one who is 13 years and 1 day old. All
right, so there's a little bit of an issue here. It's the terms that are used for minor and for adult allow for a little overlap right during that transitionary puberty, right during that transitionary period between being a child and being a biological adult. And so he wants to make sure that we understand this. So therefore,
it follows by induction that it does not. That is, it's written here, vow, and also elsewhere, also written vow. Just as
that, by the way, the other section in chapter 6 of the book of Numbers is the section dealing with the Nazirite, the person which takes on the Nazirite vow, which is a unique form of vow.
Just as in both places, if he can explicitly articulate his vow, so here, when it was ruled, if he was 13 years and 1 day old, his vows stand. If he were 12 years and 1 day old, his vows are examined for the Yafli.
Yafli, right. So what's talking about there is in the section about Nazirite, the Nazirite vow. It says the person will explicitly say their vow. And so what the rabbis deduce from that is that in order to be considered a true vow, that person who's in that in-between age, between being a child and being a full biological adult, that 12-year-old range, if they can truly articulate what the vow is and what it means, then their vow is considered a vow. But if they can't give enough intellectual backing to show that they understand the meaning of their words, then it's just the words of a child. So there is this transition moment where you go from being a stupid kid who will say, I'm never going to be your friend again, I'm never talking to you again, and all the other silly things that kids say, and then forget about by the next day, to being an adult who, when they say that, should know better than to say such a silly or stupid thing or careless thing. And in the middle, we have to check, like, wait, Johnny, what do you really mean by that? Are you really saying that with a full understanding of what you're doing? Or are you saying that because you're just blowing off steam and haven't learned to control your mouth yet? All 13-year-olds haven't learned to control their mouths either, but they should. Whereas the 12-year-old, we're still giving a little bit of leeway, depending upon whether they've got enough sechel, enough mental capacity to back it up. Does that make sense? Again, for us, who I don't think, except for the person who just left, anyone is under that age, for all of us, our words should matter, which means when we go to say something, when we say it, we are making something explicit. We are saying something that is yafli, that is clear, that is revealed, and that needs to then match what we think, what we mean. Our words should have meaning behind them. They shouldn't just be empty, blustery statements. And we are liable as though all of our words did have meaning. So since you're going to be held responsible for all of your statements, you might as well make them count. Make sense? Okay. On to Shnei Luchot HaBrit, to try and help us understand a little bit more of the feeling of this vow, the spirituality of vowing.
So I don't know, the last 4 words in this verse.
Oh, sorry. So the last 4 words are the last 4 words of verse 3, where it says, that has crossed his lips.
Oh.
Right? Everything that has come out from his lips. Right? So that's the last 4 words, which seems redundant, as we're going to see, right? Because go ahead and read that verse again, right? If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his pledge. He must carry it out.
Everything.
But if I just said, if he must carry it out, the verse would be fine.
Yeah.
Right? So what does the end of the verse give me? Right? Again, this is a general midrashic principle that every portion of a verse has to have some meaning. God didn't just try to fill up a word count. He wasn't getting paid by the word. He didn't have to fill out, the form to make sure it fit into the column in the newspaper. So if there are these additional words of these words that come out of his mouth, that must be teaching something extra. And so that's what Shnei Luchot HaBrit is going to try and suggest.
Okay, so all that has crossed his lips appear superfluous, since if we are prohibited from breaking a vow, we must obviously do according to what we have vowed. The moral lesson the Torah wishes to convey is therefore not connected to the laws of vows and oaths. Rather, the Torah emphasizes we must keep our word, even if what we have said was not in the form of a promise or a vow. Oh, Moses told the tribes of Gad and Reuben, carry out what you have said.
Right, so you may remember Gad and Reuben were the tribes that were saying we'd like to settle on this side of the Jordan, meaning the what would be the modern state of Jordan, because it works well for our cows. But we will be the vanguard. We will be the shock troops, the head soldiers going in to help on the other side of the river. And Moses said, okay, do what you said. Right, which is basically what the end of our verse is saying, which is even though they didn't say, by God, we swear we will be the vanguard, so help me God, on the hand on the Torah. Even though they didn't say it that way, they just sort of outlined almost just sort of, this is what's going to happen. Moses took that to mean you are vowing that this is what you and your compatriots will be doing. And therefore, even though the statement wasn't in that vow form, it is considered binding. Because Moses said, do what you said. Right? What you say, you should do, no matter whether you say it in the magic formula or not.
And Rashi is referring to comments that Moses was referring to Reuben and Gad, saying that they would be the spearhead of the Jewish army in their conquest and division of the land of Canaan west of the Jordan River. The latter part was something that Moses had not demanded of them. Another statement of intent had been volunteered by those tribes which had not been part of the condition Moses imposed upon them in order to retain their possessions east of the Jordan. In other words, they made a promise and they got something for it.
Well, they'd already gotten what they wanted.
They wanted that. They promised.
And they made a promise that seemed to be a bonus. But what they made wasn't a promise, it was simply a statement. They didn't say, we promise we will be the vanguard. They just said, we will be the vanguard, which, it's like saying, I'll be there on Thursday. Right? Is that a promise or is that not a promise? What Shnei Luchot HaBrit is saying is that is a promise because it was the words that came out of your mouth. Even though you didn't say it as a vow, even though you didn't use the formal language, you were making a statement of what you were going to do, and therefore others would be expecting it, it would be dependent, and this is a promise, even if it's with other words. Right? If it comes out of your mouth, do it. And if you're not prepared to do it, don't let it come out of your mouth. Just keep your mouth shut. And that's one of the great things as we're going to see as we go on, that there is no obligation to promise. There is no obligation to make a vow. There is no obligation to take an oath. There are in a few court cases, there are obligations under Jewish law, but in general, the types of oaths that we're talking about and vows that we're talking about, God doesn't tell us that we should be making vows. So therefore, if it comes out of our mouth, that was our choice, and then we need to actually follow through on what we have chosen to say. Make sense? Okay. Now we're going to get a little bit more into what all of these, this feeling of the vows are. We have to unpack a little bit of a Kabbalistic teaching here.
The letter Nun in Neder,
right,
vow,
which is the word for vow,
refers to Israel's faith in God.
Right, which you might get from the word ne'eman, right? This is a faith, a belief.
God, who in turn supervises our faith in all his mercy at all times and whenever we are not
wherever we are.
And wherever we are, not abandoning us for even a second.
All right, so the first, he actually goes through all the letters of the word neder, but we only have time to do one. But he says the nun in neder is talking about our faith in God and about the fact that our faith in God is that God is involved actively in our life at all times. Right? That's part of what it means when we say we have faith in God. It's not just that I believe God exists, it's that I believe God cares about me in this world. Everyone with us so far? Okay, keep going.
When this letter is found in the Torah written in an unusual form, like it is in Numbers or Job.
Right, in Numbers, it is actually upside down. There's a very famous section where you have this inverted nun that's bracketing part of the text. And in Job, there's a final nun written in the middle of a word, which is also rather unusual.
Yeah.
So wherever it shows up in this weird form,
it points to God's supervision of the various parts of his universe.
Right, so it's reminding us in those places where the nun shows up oddly, that because nun represents our faith in God's activity in the world, that wherever it's odd, it's a specific reminder of God's activity in the world, God's supervision of the world. Okay, so yeah, this may be a little bit of a logical stretch. Just hold on, he's getting to a point.
Our sages concluded that a vow applies even to the promise to perform a commandment when it is a result of the person making this vow having experienced proof of God's supervising his universe.
Okay.
In other words, you get scared enough.
No, sometimes it can also be inspired.
Oh, inspired.
Right, so sometimes it is a question, and that's really where the word yirah, which means fear generally, is really overlapping with awe. And oftentimes a person will be inspired by the presence of God, or overawed by the presence of God, or trembling in the presence of God. And all three of those can be a wrapped up emotional experience. And when that happens, sometimes a person will make a vow to do a commandment. So you may remember I mentioned earlier the whole, I'm going to make a vow to not eat bacon, and how silly of a vow that is. Well, what Kedushat Levi, I believe, is saying here, yes, he said sometimes you may have had an experience that will force you to redouble your effort to keep that particular commandment. So you are vowing because you have encountered God in the world in some form to do something that God has already commanded, and that he is arguing is okay. That type of reinforcing vow, because you have experienced God, not just because you're being silly, but because of this experience, is okay, as he continues to explain.
On such an occasion, the person who has had this religious experience decides to abstain even for matters which, as far as the Torah is concerned, he is within his rights to enjoy.
Right, but then, like I said, there are also these other types of vows where you make a promise that you are now not going to do something, even though the Torah gave you the option to do it. Right? That is permitted, which is an unusual idea. Right? God gave us permission, and now you're taking away your own permission voluntarily.
Well, that's how they started, by saying, let the fruits of a certain country be forbidden to me. It was things that were permitted to us.
Right.
Okay, did you want to abstain from?
And he is holding out the idea that sometimes that self-prohibition can come because of an encounter with God, right? So let's imagine that you were driving in your car and you got into a crash, and by some miracle, you walked out of the crash completely unscathed. And let's imagine that when the crash was happening, you were at the moment thinking about moving to Italy, right? You say, wow, God spared me from this. I vow I will never move to Italy. Right now, that's your choice. Now, I'm not saying that's the right way to read the reaction, but that is something that person might do. Is say, this is God giving me personally a sign. I'm never going to move to Italy because God has spared my life. Right? That could be a natural reaction. It's not necessarily the right reaction, however. Right? So it is possible, it is permissible, but is it correct? And that's what our next couple texts are going to try and tease out for us, is whether or not this kind of self-prohibition is always the right sort of response.
From the wording of the Torah, it seems clear that permission to utter vows or oaths is granted only if the person doing so did so in order to strengthen his ability to obey certain commandments that he was in danger of violating had he not reinforced his determination by means of a vow or an oath.
Okay, so what he's saying here in my mind is absolutely revelatory. What he's saying is that there's a fundamental logical problem with vows in the first place, which is, if God didn't want you to eat the fruit, if God didn't want you to live in Italy, God would have commanded you not to eat the fruit or not to live in Italy. Who are you to come along and say something that God gave you as a gift, permission to do from God's beautiful world, that you wanted no part of it? What chutzpah, right? I mean, your grandparents come and they visit you and they say, we love you so much and we'd like to give you this wonderful gift of your inheritance. And you say, no, thanks. I don't want any part of it. What? I mean, perhaps it's nice and humbling to say, I don't want to, have your money, but I mean, how rude. They are making a gift to you. Who are you to say you don't want the gift? But he entertains that there is a category of opportunity where vowing does make sense, which is where you can see that you are very close, or maybe have already transgressed a commandment. Right? Let's imagine that you were having trouble with a violent temper. Right, so that you were, just always getting into fights with people, and so you decide to make a vow that you are going to not watch boxing anymore. Maybe that always riles you up, or maybe your violent temper is because you always have discussions about your sports team, and when they lose, you get too angry. So you're gonna make a vow never to talk about the games again, or never to even go to a game again, because that's where you always have a fight. You're making a vow to give up something permitted. Going to a game, or whatever it might be, watching boxing, which boxing is a little more on the edge, but definitely these are things that are generally considered to be permitted. Even though God told you could, you're saying I won't, because if I do, I might do something that is prohibited. In this case, punching somebody and causing harm to another person when it's not like in self-defense. So this is what Kedushat HaLevi is saying could be a permitted vow, where you're not doing it out of chutzpah, you're doing it out of a wish to fulfill God's commandments. You just need a little extra self-help. You need a little extra self-guidance to guide you individually into keeping that commandment. Which means other types of vows that are just for silly, frivolous, or personal reasons don't work. That's what he's arguing. You don't go around making other vows that aren't about reinforcing our ability to keep the commandments. That vowing in general is frowned upon.
So this is also really hedging against asceticism of going to an extreme, saying I spiritually, I'm going to live in this cave, or
Right.
I'm going to wear Only.
sackcloth and right. Judaism does not give you bonus points for depriving yourself of what God permitted you. Right? You don't say, oh, wow, look at how pious that guy is. He only eats bean sprouts. Right? Even though God said he could eat all these other things, he's choosing to only eat bean sprouts. We don't call that person pious. That's not a tzaddik. Well, maybe. It might be an important dietary restriction that their doctor worked out with them. We don't know, but we don't consider that to be a mark of piety. Right? There may be a reason, but it's not
Extreme testing.
to deliberately take on unnecessary self-impositions is considered to be incorrect. That this is not a laudable behavior.
What about, I can see where this comes up when broader context, promises of tzedakah.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this especially in terms of a congregation estate plan.
Right.
So does this fit in?
So estate planning is a little bit different because the person isn't alive.
Or promise it upon my death, I promise to give this, or if I promise if I win the lottery, I will give this, or
right.
If I receive this inheritance from Aunt June, I will give this.
So those are, like in many cases, very different particular cases. So for example, an estate planning, if you were to make a pledge that says, when I die, I would like to leave, 10% of my estate to organization X. If you have not filled out a contract and binding thing that actually sets that aside, if you just made that statement to the congregation and you made that statement to your kids, when I die, make sure they get blah, blah, blah. When you die, technically your kids are not under an obligation to do it.
Right.
Right? Because you're dead. So therefore your vows are now nullified.
Right.
Right? Because you're dead. Right? You can't vow about something you'll do after you're dead, because once you're dead, you're doing nothing. That's what being dead means, kind of in the most base definition. But if you force your children to take a vow that they will transfer 10%, then when you die, they would have to. So if you say, if I inherit this, I will do X, then your promise stands. If I will win the lottery, I will do X, then your promise stands. So the case of a person before they die and the case of a person while they're alive, those details do matter significantly in finding different application. All right, as we're pushing up against the clock, Akedat Yitzchak is going to give us a little more.
Man attains his ideal state via a threefold process. 1, he must fulfill his duties toward himself. 2, he must fulfill his duties toward his fellow man. And 3, he must fulfill his duties toward God.
All right, so just think for a moment, as Akedat Yitzchak often does, how wonderful he has distilled how we can think about, just in general, the framework of our life. Right? I have a duty to myself, I have a duty to others, and I have a duty to God. If I'm doing fine on all three duties, I'm doing all right. Right? That should be the checklist that you just run through as a mental accounting to make sure that you are hitting your task list.
The prophet Micah describes man's tasks as follows. What is it that the Lord asks of you except A, to do justice, B, to practice loving kindness, and C, to walk humbly with the Lord your God? Duties toward oneself are easily understood. Therefore, the prophet refers to them by the word mishpat.
Right, so justice. So he's saying taking care of yourself is justice. Right? It is something simple, it is straightforward, it is almost what you might call natural law in the modern sense.
And duties to oneself are to ensure one's survival.
Right, so you have an obligation to keep yourself alive. You have an obligation to eat. You have an obligation to make sure that you're living a healthy lifestyle. You have an obligation not to do things that are unnecessarily risky or self-harming. That is a duty. Right? It's not just you could choose to do this or not choose to do this. You're born with an obligation to take care of yourself. Okay, but that one is the most straightforward because most people don't have to be convinced to keep themselves alive. Most people do a lot to try and keep themselves alive. That's why he uses the simpler phrase of mishpat for that one.
Performance of duties toward one's fellow man consists of putting acquired good character traits to practical use. Our sages display a negative attitude toward people who make vows.
Right. Who make vows. Remember, it isn't saying who break vows. It's a negative attitude towards people who make vows. Continue.
A prompt fulfillment of the vow is equated with offering a sacrifice on a private altar at times when private altars are forbidden. The reason is that though clearly there is a good intention, the venue is unwelcome.
All right, so yes, it's nice that you wanted to offer a sacrifice, but right now you should have gone to Jerusalem. Right? You shouldn't be doing it in your backyard. There were different time periods in our history when private altars were allowed, like with Abraham, and when they weren't allowed, like when the temple stood. So the intent is right? The person wants to praise God, the person wants to celebrate with God, fine, but you did it the wrong way. And so too, he's arguing that the sages point out that making vows unnecessarily, you have the right intention, you want to do something good, but you're doing it the wrong way. And that is something that is a problem, right? The right intention can lead to the wrong action. And people often misunderstand that. They think that as long as they feel good about what they're doing, that whatever they're doing must be good. It's not that simple.
And this is true even when the vow relates to a mitzvah, something desirable in the eyes of God. When the subject matter of the vow is about something merely permissible, the vow itself is viewed as reprehensible, since it presupposes that by accepting the gift, God indicates his need of it. What could be more laughable?
Right, I'm going to give to you, God, this wonderful vow, right? Whether it be the vowing of a sheep or a vowing of a self-imposed imposition, for God's glory, I will never eat oranges again, or whatever nonsense you might say. God's like, what? I need this? I'm somehow glorified by you making these decisions to make vows that are totally unnecessary. It's one thing if you need to make a vow to help yourself keep a mitzvah. All right, fine, I understand. But these other types of vows, you're not proving yourself to God. You're not giving God any greater praise. This is God. God doesn't need that kind of vowing, these types of extraneous promises. And by the way, neither do we each other. Right? If you've ever had a friend who is constantly using the phrase, I promise, or I swear to you, that's usually the person you probably rely on the least. Right? The person who is most cavalier with their promises, their vows, their oaths, their swearing, and all of that, that language just comes so quickly to their mouth, is usually the person who's trying to make up for a pattern of not fulfilling what they say. Right? Just like when everyone says, believe me, I'm probably not going to believe whatever comes next. Because if you have to convince me to believe you by saying believe me, rather than by, just being honest, I'm not going to be convinced by those words. So what Akedat Yitzchak is saying is that, yes, we have a very long tradition of not liking vows, which is why it might be not too surprising that we also have a tradition of how to get out of vows, which is what we're going to turn to now. And with Chizkuni first talking about how nullifying a vow cannot be a personal matter.
The party failing to fulfill his vow must not profane himself by nullifying it.
Right? The one who made the vow can't cancel the vow. Right? Even though we said vows aren't always good and generally aren't good, once you've made it, you're not allowed to cancel it yourself.
However, others, that is a legal court, do have the power to release him from the obligations he imposed on himself at a time of personal stress, not realizing all the implications of what he had said at that time.
So the general rule that is used is that the court will say, well, wait, when you promised not to eat oranges ever again, did you realize that meant you also weren't going to be able to eat this, that, and the other, which are derived from orange projects? Do you realize that you weren't going to be able to take vitamin C supplements, which were important but are derived from orange products? Did you realize that this would have a harm to the economy? There's all sorts of different implications that most people don't realize when they make a vow that can then be used as a reason why a person should no longer be bound by that vow. Because when they made it under false understanding of the situation, which again reminds us that making the vow should only be if you truly understand the situation 100% through. Since we usually can't, it's better to keep your mouth shut and not make vows, not take oaths like this. And it should not be done cavalierly, because chances are you don't truly understand the implications of the words you're saying to all of the nth degree, which is why it became common for there to be a formal court setting to be able to nullify for ourselves vows that were perhaps going to be said inadvertently. Because we recognize that we're human, that even with all of this, I'm sure that probably by tomorrow, I will have said to someone something that could be misunderstood as a promise or vow that I didn't want to be thought of as a promise or vow. And I can guarantee you by next week, I will have forgot that I ever said it. because at the time I didn't take it that seriously because I didn't even think that I was saying a promise or a vow. It's just these things can happen. They can slip. And then we'll forget. But God doesn't forget. So it became part of the pre-Yom Kippur service to make a formal declaration in a court setting that will nullify these vows. We now call this Kol Nidre, and we sing it beautifully, but more important than the melody is to understand the meaning, which is why we're going to read literally what the Aramaic is telling us.
All vows, renunciations, bans, oaths, formulas of obligation, pledges, and promises that we vow or promise to ourselves and to God from this Yom Kippur to the next, may it approach us for good, we hereby retract. May they all be undone, repealed, canceled, voided, annulled, and regarded as neither valid nor binding. Our vows shall not be considered vows. Our renunciations shall not be considered renunciations, and our promises shall not be considered promises.
Okay, that is a good translation. Now, you just did a slight hesitation when you read the phrase from this Yom Kippur to the next.
Yeah.
Right, because I make you bet at different times you've seen
Yes.
Machzorim, the Siddur we use for high holidays, that said from last Yom Kippur till now.
Right.
And there's a difference there, right? Are we canceling the vows we made last year, or are we canceling the vows that we are about to make? Well, the answer is depends on the Siddur you look at, the Machzor, right? The original form was the past tense. And this was a bit of, shall we say, folk liturgy. This wasn't a top-down piece of writing. This is something that came up from the grassroots of the people who wanted to feel that they could dispense with any of the mistaken vows that they had made, that they have forgotten, and they cannot go back to deliberately to nullify. They wanted to cancel all of those slips of the tongue that they had said so that they go into the new year for good. And so they came up with this formula to do it. But the sages, the rabbis of the time, said, but that doesn't work, right? You can't nullify what you don't know, because you can't nullify after the fact something you've forgotten. What you can do, however, is you can pre-state that any sentence that sounds like a promise should not be understood as a promise. Remember I said at the beginning how in modern Hebrew people will say bli neder to sort of say what I just said wasn't really a vow. This is doing one giant statement of that for the coming year. Anything I may slip up and say in the coming year should not be misunderstood as a vow, a promise, or an oath in the way that Numbers 30 is trying to tell us a vow and an oath should be taken. Yes, I will try, I will attempt, I will do, but don't hold it against me that my tongue sometimes speaks inelegantly. And this is something that I can do in advance before I commit the act, rather than after the fact when I've completely forgotten the act. Because remember, if you've remembered the act, you can get out of it by going to a court and having them see where the problem lies, and then it can be undone because you misunderstood why you shouldn't have vowed in the first place. So it's the Machzor Lev Shalem, which is the modern conservative Machzor, says in its marginal note, the Jewish leaders opposed its recitation until we changed this.
Right, they opposed the recitation. Rabbeinu Tam changed the language from past to future.
That was around the 11th century.
Oh, that
11th, 12th century?
Oh, that won't go. Kol Nidre mentions 7 types of promises and 7 verbs of nullification because 7 symbolizes completion.
Right. So that's in case you wonder why we're going through a thesaurus of different words for promising. It's as a symbol of everything. It would be the equivalent of saying from A to Z in English. Right. By doing 1 through 7, you've covered all your bases, and any other verbs that you might think of are covered by implication with this vow. So we do Kol Nidre. We always do it before Yom Kippur officially begins. That's why Kol Nidre is done before Mariv. It's also the reason why you're still wearing your talit, because you put your talit on before the evening service begins, and you just don't take it off. You just leave it on during the service, which is permitted. We don't put a talit on at night, but you can still be wearing your talit when night begins.
What if somebody comes in late?
Then they miss Kol Nidre.
Yeah.
And people should not come in late,
They
because
should vow not to do that.
although the sages said that Kol Nidre was not as important as the grassroots makes it feel, it is still, I believe, one of the best moments to remind ourselves of the importance of our speech. So if someone were to come in late, I would say, no, there's no reason for them to put on a talit. And if they are going to put on a talit, they should definitely not be saying the blessing, even if it's the first time they've worn the talit that day, because it's not the mitzvah to wear a talit at night. It's really only the mitzvah to say it in the morning. But if they would feel out of place without a talit, they could put it on without a blessing. But more importantly, get there for Kol Nidre. And as we chant through this, and you should be trying to recite it together, this is a legal formula that is good for us all to say in unison. Think about, how will I avoid misusing these words and this attitude in the coming year? How will I make sure that I don't say things I don't want to say, and that when I do make a commitment, it may not be a vow, but I will still try to live up to it to the best of my ability. And if we do that, then we are keeping very much with what Torah wants us to do.
How did it become in Spain and after the exile such a huge, it was a huge emotional impact?
Well, for many, and the phrase that goes immediately after, immediately before this, right, was because of the forced conversion. So if someone swore an oath to another faith, whether it be Islam or Catholicism at the time, then they wanted to feel that those vows didn't count, that they only said them under duress. Now, Jewish law already says that a vow taken under duress is no vow, right? If someone puts a gun to your head and says, promise to me that you're going to give me $100, and then they put the gun down, you're under no obligation to give them the $100. And you can't say, but you promised. No, it's, under duress, a vow doesn't count as a vow.
Right.
But emotionally,
the community.
and it also was the case that there were people who did not have a sword put to their throat. Right? As much as we do and should honor all of the people who were either martyred or who suffered at the hands of those who tried to force conversions, whether it be in the Muslim or Christian world, some people did willingly convert. And they thought it was a good idea at the time. And some of them then returned. They wanted to escape. They decided that it wasn't a good idea. And when they came back, there were mixed feelings about these people, which was, are you one of the people who wanted to convert and then came back? Are you one of the people who were forced to convert and rather than vetting every person's biography, the community said, no, if you want to come back to Judaism, you are welcome back. And if you've been among them and you come back, we will still pray alongside you. You can still be part of the community as you return from wherever it was you were taken or had temporarily chosen to be. And whatever vows you made under those systems, they don't count. Make sense? Okay, so yes, it definitely added a new emotional layer during those centuries.
There are also that until a couple hundred years ago, promises to be an indentured servant or contracts, you could make a promise and end up in slavery.
Yes.
Fortunately, we don't see that anymore. And
generally, although human trafficking
sometimes-
is still a huge problem.
Yeah, but that was.
And as I like to remind people painfully, there are more people who are slaves now than have ever been slaves in all of human history. Yeah.
Rabbi, there's one other question or point.
Just a second.
Okay.
Let me just hit the end